Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to the Vicinity and Beyond podcast with me, Henry Ginman.
And me, Julie Grail.
And today we are continuing on from our last podcast where we looked at what makes a good bid. And we've separated this out as a topic today of what is good governance for a bid, because it's a big enough topic in its own right. And I think what we're looking for here is a bid which is transparent, accountable, financially sound, responsive to businesses, and as a basic requirement, legally compliant. But actually, what are the structures that a bid needs to have in place? How does a bid act? What does good governance look like? And Julie, perhaps we should start talking about standards.
Yeah. It's interesting because the way the legislation and regulations work, it's very light touch and non-prescriptive on sort of how the bid organisation runs the bid arrangements that are defined in the regulations. In practice, the vast majority of bids are a company limited by guarantee. 2 or 3 are community interest companies. But they could be just an informal, loose partnership of bodies. Well, of course, we wouldn't want that because they don't have checks and balances on them. And it can just be a route of an additional funding stream into local authorities. I don't like that model either because I think it's about businesses being accountable. But ultimately, because nothing much is prescribed, we wrote a principle of industry standards some time ago. Well, that's the royal we. I wrote industry standards. And we sort of published it back in 2018-19. And it was the sort of basic principle that says for every bid that exists in the country, not just big ones that have got big budgets and lots of money, for every bid, we should have a basic entry level kind of benchmark, kite mark that says these things are not difficult. You should absolutely do these things first and foremost before you consider yourself, sufficient sort of scrutiny as an organisation. And they're really simple things. Like the starting point is, and it might seem a bit odd, but the first one is you need to publicly state staff contact details. Who are you paying and what you're paying them to do? And that might seem odd, but actually there's not many now, but there have been bids that have just got a holding website page with an info at email address and a mobile number and no name anywhere. Well, that's just not good enough, is it? This is businesses' money. They need to know where their money's going. That's just absolutely wrong to not transparently say your money is being collected in this manner and it's being spent by these people under this structure. So,
do you want those people to be known?
yeah,
It's quite if we visit a place and we're looking to implement an app and we go around and we speak to businesses, it's very evident which of the places where the bid manager, the bid team are known, and you walk in there and they say, "Oh, are you with?" And you say, "Yes, that's who we're with." But other places we might go and we're explaining what a bid is to people, and you're kind of you're fighting a losing battle at that point. So not just from a, I guess, governance standpoint, but from a tactical standpoint. That makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the industry standards do a variety of things. There's 11 standards. So staff contact details is the first one, as I said, and it's so easy and so obvious, but not everybody does it. You should have your bid business plan that went to ballot publicly available through the whole term of your bid, not just at the beginning, because it does live the entire term of the bid. So that should be an easy click through. That's just obvious, but it doesn't happen with everyone.
Can I ask, with the business plan, 5 years is quite a long time. A lot can change in 5 years. How rigorous should a bid be in sticking to a business plan, and how much should a business plan give them scope to vary their activities?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because in the early days, we would write an entire 5-year kind of detailed budget, and after the sort of first 2 or 3 years, it became clear we can't be that detailed in the second to fifth year. But what we can do is have some principles that guides any change of budget allocation. So we used to write in the early days. We used to write footnotes in the budget page as a business plan that says the board of directors can vary the project themes, the budget themes, by only a certain percentage so that you couldn't have a wholesale change. Now, there was something slightly scuppered that principle when we had the London bombings back in 2007, July 2007. The big bid in central London, USN Company, inevitably, had a whole series of things that were designed that they were spending and rolling out. Suddenly, the needs became very, very different very, very quickly because they'd had a significant event. And they went to board and said, we need to adjust our spend. And actually, had they had that tight parameter in place that says we can't go beyond that amount, they would have become unrealistic because we should be responsive to need. But ultimately, the backstop is always you've got a company board, a board of directors who are legally appointed. They're on Companies House. It's their duty to act in the best interests of the company, and it's their duty to make those decisions and record those decisions in minutes to demonstrate if change is being made, why it's being made. And that coming back to things we said before, you have to have, in our third podcast, we talked about evidence-based decisions. You have to have good evidence-based decisions as to why you make that change. So not to your question, we're writing a 5-year business plan. We're setting the framework for what we're doing, but we're also setting the management and governance principles in that business plan to say, if things need to change, this is how we will change them. And that's where the governance piece becomes so important.
And it's available, it's accessible.
Yeah.
And downloadable, presumably from
But in surprisingly, in a lot it isn't. And actually, something came up the other day on one of the across the industry. We've got various sort of comms channels, and there's a active WhatsApp group across the industry. And somebody asked the question. I won't name them. Somebody asked the question: our board of directors have changed compared to who's published in the business plan, and I've been told I should republish the business plan. And there's a whole debate about whether you should or you shouldn't. Well, no, of course you shouldn't, because actually you should be actively updating the personalities of your company on your website all the time. What your business plan, if you actually put names and photos in your business plan, what it should be doing is showing who they're representing and why. If you've got 11 people on your board and the representative split is by retail, small business, large business, whatever, it's not who the person is, it's what the place is. So you've got to have some sense of reason in what changes and what doesn't, and how. So yes, it's got to be available, it's got to be correct, but it's also got to have some things that are kind of moving feasts when needed.
And so working through your standards then, so staff contact details, business plan, and you want to...
Next one is ballot results. And again, picking up on what we talked about in podcast 3, one of my biggest bugbears is turnout. Legally, in the regulations, the ballot result announcement does not need to reference turnout. I think that's a big failing because it means you can hide and you shouldn't be able to hide. So what I've written in the industry standards is to be a good bid with the standard, you should be overtly reporting your turnout. And people do dodge that. If you've got a bad turnout, you don't want to say it. You might ask me what bad is. I generally aim for 50% minimum. I really worry if people don't publish it. And if people don't publish it, it's usually because it's very low. And very low, well, for me, anything lower than 30 is not acceptable at all. But actually, there are ballots that have come through in less than 20% turnout. And when you think you need a majority of those that vote, in worst case scenario, just make the numbers easy. If there are 100 voters and only 20 of them voted, you'd only need 11 to have said yes. How is that right, to have 11 businesses in an area say yes and all 100 have to pay? Just not right.
I think it's we need to take the shame and the stigma out of a low result historically and be able to kind of take that as a learning opportunity and say, what do we need to do differently next time? And a little bit different, but I have an interview question whenever we interview someone to join us, and I ask them, they say, I don't like surprises, so tell me anything that you think I should know now, which could cause difficulty or friction, because if I know what it is at that point, actually we could manage that.
Yeah.
We
You can
can know what it is,
preempt it
and
a
we
bit.
can
Yeah.
put in plans to make sure. And
Yeah.
often things people come up with aren't barriers at all.
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
similar here. We
Yeah.
want to know what that is. We want to be public about it. We don't want to run away from it. We want to say, what is this telling us? What do we need to do differently? And let's learn from it and move forward from it.
It's interesting. Perhaps you're as much of a control freak as me, because I hate surprises. Next one is bid board of directors. And again, it's a really simple point, but and the vast majority, as I said, if you're a company on Companies House, the directors are appointed anyway as legal directors. So they're accessible on Companies House. So why would you not be comfortable saying who they are? You absolutely should say who they are.
Yes.
And you should say why they're there. And in terms of the actual sort of scale and type of board for each place, there's no one size fits all. Often bids say to me, what size is a typical bid board? It does slightly depend on the place. It depends on the kind of nature of the place. But there are some general rules that I think the board must be big enough to be representative and big enough to not be a clique. So, and what number is big enough to not be a clique? Sort of the minimum, I think, is about 11 directors, but you don't really want to go much more than 15 because it becomes a bit tricky to manage. But if it is more than 15, then you absolutely make sure you put an executive committee in between board meetings to get stuff done.
Yeah.
But you think about, all the sectors of a place and make sure they're all represented and make sure they are all there in as impartial manner as possible. And actually, talking about the sort of Companies House responsibilities, when I do governance training with bid boards, I hammer home to them the responsibilities of being a legal director on Companies House. And often people just don't realise what they've signed up to. There are rules and regulations and responsibilities and liabilities. And when you step into the room of a bid board, whatever hat you came wearing, figuratively, you might have actually worn one, but whatever hat you've come wearing from your own business or the sector or, a geographical area of the town or city, you take that off and you put the bid hat on and you act in the best interests of the company as you make decisions. And the smaller the bid board and the less transparent that bid board, the greater likelihood the decisions are inappropriate.
So this is really interesting. I'd like to dig into this a bit more, because my perception of a typical organisation is that there are fewer people at the top and there are more people at the bottom, and you have a sort of pyramid effect. Whereas with a bid, it's almost the other way around. You've got all these people, because the board of directors are the bosses, and they are recruiting the bid manager who's operational, and then the bid manager might only have a couple of other people working for them. And so you end up with 15 decision makers, but very few operators. But what you're saying there is the smaller it gets, the less representative it is of the place. Completely understand that. How do you avoid the situation of having too many cooks?
Sometimes a board of directors is not necessarily about scale. Sometimes it's about types of business and types of actual personalities. Sometimes there's a tendency to micromanage the team, and actually part of that comes back to the training that we do of the board to understand where their role starts and stops. There's a macro strategic responsibility they hold. They're ultimately guiding the management team to ensure good delivery. They're ensuring good decisions, good quality decisions are made, well-evidenced decisions are made and recorded in the minutes. And they're ensuring that they have appropriate financial and procurement practices in place to make those decisions and report against them. But they shouldn't be getting into the weeds of each project. Having said that, some businesses absolutely want to be in the weeds of the projects, and that's where you put another layer of governance structure. You might have the company board that takes all those legal responsibilities, but then you have some working groups, subgroups, subcommittees that then do actually do the weeds of a project. And that's the brilliant kind of value of bids. You get some fabulous people who absolutely want to be in the detail, and they get involved and support the staff team on a pro bono basis because they're absolutely, driven and understand the detail of a place. And they want to give their time for free. And that's fine. That's great. What isn't fine, if those people are driving the direction of travel and spend of a bid board for their own gain.
Yeah.
That isn't okay.
So what would you say to a bid manager who's come into a bid, who's looking at their board, who thinks, I've got some people here who originally signed up because they thought it was going to boost their own local prestige, that perhaps aren't thinking with the bid hat on and representing the bid, that aren't adhering to the duties that Companies House would put on them. What powers do you as a bid manager have to change your own board, given they appoint you?
Yeah, it is a funny dynamic, isn't it? And actually, it's a really, really common question, actually. Either a bid manager comes in and doesn't know what they don't know and is just uncomfortable about the whole thing, or a bid manager fully understands that it's not right, but doesn't quite know how to go about doing it. And I have to say, a lot of what they do is then bring me in to do it for them because I can be the henchman that says, here's the facts. It is difficult for the bid manager, chief exec, who's paid and managed. Their direct line management is through the chair, usually. It is difficult because there's a sort of a bit of a not wanting to bite the hand that feeds you. However, go back to the morals we talked about in podcast 3. We have to be doing the right thing here. And if you are the paid member of staff heading up a team, whether you're a team of 1 or you're a team of 21, it's your duty to report to the board and ensure everything is done correctly. And if the behaviour of the board is fettering you doing that, you have to deal with it. It is the chief exec's responsibility in a business, irrespective of scale, to do that. And often I'll say, I'll talk through details with a bid manager or chief exec, and they'll sort of cringe and go, but that's really difficult. Yeah, but what's the alternative? The alternative is you getting it wrong, you be challenged for getting it wrong, and you're in the wrong.
Yes.
You can't be in the wrong. And once you know something, you can't unthink it, can you? Well, I can't. Once I've seen something, I can't unsee it. So yeah, it's hard conversations. But it's rarely done out of deliberate malice or fraud. It's a level of ignorance. Sometimes there has been some fraud in the bid industry, and none of us like that. And all of us good bids don't want that in our industry, and we want it thrashed out. But mostly it's just not been thought through fully enough.
I keep thinking of the that parish council video that went viral, where you've got people in positions of some authority, but perhaps enjoying that authority a little
too much,
and aren't thinking in the interest of what they're doing, and actually becomes power play politics. I can understand how the board of directors could be the greatest asset, but also a real anchor if you haven't got that right within the standards and empathize with people trying to navigate a difficult situation. But I think what you're saying there is have the hard conversation. You've got to play the political game, I think. Win allies, bring in external people who can advise and force through good standards on yourself and manage up.
And actually picking up the local authority point, that's often one that can be difficult because there's no obligation for boards to have bid boards to have a local authority member on per se. They're often there because they're a levy payer. They're a significant levy payer in some places, or they're there because dutifully, they're representing the residential community. They have a wider kind of role. So there's no right or wrong, but many bids do have local authorities represented on their boards, either by an officer or by a councillor or by both in some cases. But there have been lots of examples, which I won't name, but again, people will probably relate to this one, where they get stuck with a personality that is not helping their cause. And their personality may either be a councillor or a council officer who's there by representation, but is an absolute problem to the cause. And we've had this a couple of times over the last couple of years where I've reflected back to them and reminded them. You go back to the Companies House principles of the responsibilities of directors and what your articles say. And what your articles say is it's the responsibility of existing directors to effectively hire and fire their counterparts. If there's rogue behaviour, if there's conflicts of interest that can't be resolved, if there's been any inappropriate activity, they can fire people, and they absolutely have to, their fellow directors, and vice versa. If there's appointments to be made, it's the responsibility of the incumbent directors to accept them or not. And this becomes quite a difficult conversation with people. I kind of see people have this sinking feeling when I say, but it's up to you who you have from the local authority. It's not up to them. And they go, oh, no, it doesn't work like that. No, they tell us. Yeah, but it's up to you to accept them. It's your board. It's not their board. And I always encourage a bid, if they want a local authority representative, to go through the formal committee clerk structure so that it's a formally nominated person out of the local authority. They have a whole clerk system doing this for outside bodies. So you go through that formal structure. And then it's not a given. If they want to decide which representative they're going to offer up to the bid, that's up to them. But it's not a given that the bid takes it. So then that gets offered up as a, and they might give 2 or 3 representatives, or they may just give 1. That's offered up to the incumbent directors to decide the value of that person onto the board and whether they accept them or not. And actually, that's the good checks and balances. If someone's being offered up to you, and this is from a business community or local authority, someone's being offered up to you, and you're nervous about their credentials, or you're nervous about their reputation, you don't have to accept them. And that's quite empowering to bid teams. I've had bid teams where they've first gone, oh, I couldn't do that. How are we going to have to do that? And they go, am I allowed to do that? Yes, you're allowed to do that. You absolutely should do that. Read your articles. Here we are. In the articles, there it says it. You must own it. And then your board behaves in the way it should behave, and you don't get bad behaviour on it. You don't get fraudulent activity. You don't get misguided decisions being made. You don't, the articles will absolutely talk about conflicts of interest. It's okay to have vested interests. It's common to have a vested interest because by the very nature, the businesses that are in the town want improvements in that town, some of which will improve what they're doing. That's why they all want to do it. That's fine. But what you mustn't do is allow a decision to be made or steered by someone who's going to be a direct recipient of that spend. And so you have systems in place, you have a register of interests, you have a standing item on an agenda that says right up front, are there any conflicts need to be registered today? And if they are, and if they're of a substantive nature, you invite that director to leave the room. The chairman manages that conversation, and you decide, and you legally, as directors, decide whether that conflict is of such a scale that you need to leave them outside the room whilst you have that debate. Sometimes you go, thanks for raising it, it's fine. We've just considered it's de minimis, come back and we'll carry on. Sometimes it's massive. And I've worked with putting together registers of interest for bids, and particularly the smaller locations, much more so than the large ones. That doesn't just cover, is your business directly going to financially benefit or indeed be issued a contract from the bid levy money. It's much bigger than that. I had one, I definitely won't name where this was, but I had one quite some time back where I had a director on the board absolutely adamantly telling me he had no link to a recycling contract that was being funded by the bid. And I said, but you do. You absolutely do. I know you do. No, I don't. I said, who runs it? So-and-so. And I said, and I know that's your ex-wife. And he said, but she's my ex-wife. I said, yes, but you've got children. So the funds are pooled for the benefit of your children. So you are directly linked to that contract. You can't get away from that. And that's difficult. That's uncomfortable, but it has to be said. Often in smaller places, there is a crossover. You often find with a director on a bid board, their partner might be a councillor on the council. That's okay, but you mustn't hide it. You must say it.
Yes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that wouldn't have been awarded anyway, but it just means you've got to remove yourself from the decision-making process and allow more independent people to make a judgment based on more objective facts.
Yeah. And that must be recorded in the bid minutes. And those, legally, those minutes, company minutes, need to be held for 10 years and they need to be made available.
And that's another standard.
It is. And again, people got uncomfortable about the idea of minutes of board meetings being made available. And what we've said on that one is, I understand the sensitivities. We're not saying you have to routinely upload a full set of minutes every time you do it on a public website for anyone to access. I mean, some do, and some are perfectly happy with that. But you don't have to do that, because that does slightly incite people to go and dig, which can be a bit unhelpful. But what you should do is be comfortable that the minutes record your behaviour appropriately and that you're happy for any levy payer to see them. And so they might be available for request. We did say in the standards it doesn't mean they have to be publicly posted, but they have to be available for inspection on request. And, sometimes there are matters that get discussed in a board meeting of a highly confidential or personal matter. Well, that just has to become a closed section of the meeting, and the minutes are not recorded, and you have to just reference that happened. That's not wrong either. That's legally appropriate. There are things you can't have made public, especially if it's about personnel issues, but that's okay. That's just redacted from the minutes and it's referenced that it was a closed session. But these things, you shouldn't shy away from them. You should embrace them and wonder. We had one years ago, very long time ago, small market town who got themselves in a real pickle because small businesses were uncomfortable about the governance, were not involved in the dialogue, didn't feel it was a transparent bid, talked to their local authority didn't help much, and they were trying to find a way of getting kind of info, and they challenged the bid to provide the minutes, and the answer that came from the bid to these small businesses was, the articles preclude us providing them to you. That's not the answer. What the articles say, company articles say, that minutes of meetings and accounts should not be released beyond directors until approved by directors. And that's to protect half-hearted or unfinished information being issued. The minutes need to be correct and approved as correct, and accounts need to be signed off by this legal responsibility. The directors need to sign them off before they're made public. That doesn't mean they can't ever be given. It just means the directors have a responsibility to make sure they're correct first. And they got themselves in such a pickle over it. And you've got to kind of work backwards and say, why wouldn't you want people to see them? What have you got to hide?
I think these things don't have to be difficult now either. I mean, the AI tools we use for recording meeting notes and
you're an AI god, aren't you? I'm not in that world yet.
I'm interested.
Clearly my age.
I think it's amazing, and just how much these kind of instances makes my life easier.
Yeah.
Wouldn't 100% rely on them. You definitely need to read them afterwards and send them out, get them approved. But it saves a whole load of time if you can use tools like that to record the minutes of those meetings.
Yeah.
So minutes of board meetings, and we've sort of referenced the governance structure a bit, but
so legally, from company articles point of view, your company board is paramount. That's where the responsibility lies. You might choose to have additional structures beneath the company board. Legally, if you have a subcommittee of any sort doing anything, if it has any powers at all, it must have at least one company director on.
Okay.
What I tend, and you need to set right terms of reference for it, what I tend to often say to bids is, don't get bogged down in creating such a structure of frequent meetings with minutes and everything and loads of armies of people. The tail wags the dog then. You don't actually do any work. All you do is go to meetings. And you mustn't get bogged down in having to routinely do quarterly when actually quarterly is not required. And often, like the working group principle, it's so important that you've got dialogue with businesses and that you're actively working. Look, as we talked about earlier, these often small independent businesses, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's specialists in a big corporate. They're so in the weeds of a project. It's brilliant that they're involved with you, but sometimes it's only really short life of a project development process, and you actually only need to have 2 or 3 meetings on it before you kick it off and it makes it happen. You don't have to keep going back to it. What you're doing in those subgroups is always making sure you're keeping your kind of tentacles out across your business community so that you're spending the money well, and then you're reporting it all back into the board and demonstrating you're representing the voice of businesses. But as I say, especially small teams, you can spend your life in meetings and not actually deliver anything, and that's an utter waste of time. And often, putting a director in a subcommittee legally so that they take responsibility depends on personalities. Sometimes that actually isn't very effective. I'll quite often discourage that and instead not give the subcommittee any power, give them the voice, but make the decisions at company board. And that sort of takes away that, because it can become very diluted power.
How do you balance, if you're making a decision at company board level and maybe you're having quarterly board meetings, do you become quite slow at making decisions?
Yeah, you can do. I mean, I generally advocate. It does depend on the maturity of a bid and the scale of the bid and the nature of the characters on a bid board. I think the kind of perfect model, if you can get to it, is have quarterly company board meetings where all the formal structure happens, but in between have some kind of executive committee that is core principles in between, keeping the finances rolling, keeping HR practices in place, any kind of immediate response issues, not having the full power of the board, but being able to have interim activity. Because yes, between a quarterly meeting, a lot can happen and it can slow down too much if you can't make some decisions. I'm also a real stickler for scale and quorum, because company articles as a starting point, if you take model articles, you only need minimum 2 directors, and they are the quorum. That's not bid boards. That's not what we should be doing. We've got a template of articles for bid companies that we created in the original pilot that we ran all those years ago. It's still freely available. Trouble is, it's not hosted anywhere, but it is freely available, so no one should go and spend money writing articles. And that, I always advocate that a minimum quorum should be 5. And as I said, in terms of number of directors, you should be at kind of 11 or so. And if you have an executive committee doing things, the minimum number of that should be 3, but really it's 4 or 5, because you get back to the point of, you don't really want decisions to be made by the few, because if decisions are made by the few, either they're not challenged enough, they're doing it well-meaning but haven't thought it through, or they can't be challenged and they're doing it fraudulently. Neither of which we should allow to happen. If you've got 500 people paying and decisions are made by 2 or 3 people, it's not transparent enough.
Okay. And moving through some more of the standards then, procurement policy, we've touched on that a couple of times.
Yeah, this one was the one that all the bids hated when I put it in, because it was the hardest to achieve, and actually probably the one that even some of the good bids didn't have. But it was one of the reason these things became the final 11 standards was because I reviewed the industry and pulled out the problem areas, and I was trying to fix problems. And actually, pure procurement was a real problem in that bids just hadn't thought through what policy they had and whether they applied it or not. And it goes back to that point. If you don't have any policies in place, you can get into a position where there's a rogue decision made and nothing stops them doing it. What we did find was a procurement policy might have been in place in a bid company, but they'd never used it or evidenced using it. So what this standard requires you to do is not just to have one, but to evidence when you use it in a reference in a board minute. And that became the delay for quite a few people getting the standards, because they go, we've got one. Yeah, but it's not evidence. Well, we've only just got it. Well, you're going to have to wait then, and you're going to have to show us how you use it. And what that really means is, you got 25k to spend on, I don't know, a marketing and comms strategy and a load of activation delivery in your high street. And rather than just being able to give it to your wife's sister because she has an agency in town, you need to go through an open process. Now, not necessarily at all levels full protracted tender like a local authority would do, because we've got to be proportionate, and bits
Yes.
haven't got enough staff and all of that. But absolutely explicit in, at the very minimum, having price comparison, true price comparison, true quotes, true exposure of costs, and exposure of conflicts of interest. So nobody can knowingly agree to the right price project without knowing that it's the wife's sister. You know, so that procurement policy says those various things, puts different levels in of price of sort of projects. In some cases, they actually, quite a few more local bids will have a local first principle as well. If you can find a supplier local, that gets the priority. That's quite difficult to police, because sometimes then if your local provider is actually twice the price of somebody somewhere else, it's then quite difficult to justify best value. But it's a proportionate process that then is actively used and referenced in the minutes.
Okay.
The next one I sort of touched on a bit before as well, the register of interests, pecuniary and personal interests. And as I said, it's not just saying a director is a director on this bid company and on a supplier, but it's the director's wife is, or ex-wife or sister, or, Auntie Maud or wherever. We've got to be really transparent about that. Much more in smaller places than bigger places, because there are crossovers.
Okay. We've got a few we haven't touched on, but I'm conscious of time. What I'm interested in is, and we've mentioned a few in passing, but where are we as bids typically falling down? Where are we weakest?
We're the most impactful problem, in my view, is not recognising conflicts of interest.
Okay.
And that then sort of overlays a whole load of those different standards we've talked about. And that's from a staff team point of view and a board point of view. Also right at the beginning, you've got to look at the whites of someone's eyes and say, this is okay. This is not my business I'm running. It's the business's business. And we've got to be absolutely open and transparent. So that's the biggest thing for me. But actually, just being professional in the processes that we run at all times, and knowing that we are accountable to an entire membership of levy payers. Interesting point, actually. This is one that's quite controversial. Company members versus company directors. And we didn't put this in the standards. It's actually quite a difficult one. I don't advocate. So some bids, I'll go backwards. Some bids misguidedly think that by being a levy payer, a business is automatically opted into being a legal company member of the company. Incorrect. Not fact. The only way a company member, only way any levy payer becomes a company member is if they've actively opted in through a written process and have come onto a register of company members. I don't advocate, and I know this is probably against some of the anti-bid lobby, I do not advocate actively trying to sign up company membership, because we have 500, 600, 700 levy payers, many of whom have corporate policies that won't allow them to sign up to company memberships. And indeed, it's almost impossible in terms of a workload issue to keep that register of members active. So rather than getting caught up in it being wrong and being kind of faulty, my position is we don't have an active register of members. We have directors are all members, and then every other levy payer is not legally a company member, but is who we are reporting to. So we do better almost than the bid that has a register that is only 35 people that aren't really the right people anyway. And we openly, continually, communicate with all. Good example of this actually is AGMs. Legally, there's no requirement in the Companies Act 2006 now to run an AGM anyway. But from a bid point of view, you want to run an annual meeting.
Yes.
Even if you don't call it an AGM, you should run an open public meeting. And people used to get caught up in or sort of tripped up by an AGM can only have company members speaking, and therefore if they weren't a company they couldn't speak. That's a nonsense. We should therefore have an open meeting for all levy payers. Anyone can speak about anything, and we need to hear those voices. Canterbury is a great example of it. They, for years, have done a really, really brilliant open public meeting. They get well over 100 people each time. They get, very pro, very anti, and everything in between. And they have a really good debate. That's what we should be seeking to do. We should be open about it.
These are the core governance points then, aren't they?
Yeah.
Board meetings quarterly, an open general meeting annually.
Yeah.
Smaller subcommittees that might meet on specific issues more regularly. Doesn't have to be overly burdensome. I know as we talk it through in one go, it all seems like quite a lot. I can understand that. But actually, if we focus in on the outcomes of delivering what does good look like, doesn't seem overly burdensome.
It's not. And it goes back to that principle of the mindset of we're running a business of using other people's money. We need to be responsive. We need to allow feedback. We need to be willing to take feedback. We need to take criticism. We mustn't shy away from people challenging us. I love the challenge. This isn't an invitation, I hasten to add, but I love the challenge of somebody who doesn't like a bid talking to me, because I believe in bids when they're good.
Yeah.
And we should be willing to have those conversations. None of us good bids want bad bids. And so we shouldn't shy away from wanting to be good and doing it well and having that debate with anybody who's paying. If they're paying the bills of the bid, we should be willing to communicate with them.
One of the really interesting examples I've come across of feedback is Netflix and Reed Hastings' book. And he talks about how anyone can give feedback at any time, anywhere, to the point at which he'll be up on stage giving a company presentation and someone will yell out, that's not the point, or what have you. And newcomers apparently to Netflix are shocked by this. And they go, you're calling out the CEO on stage when he's talking. But it's part of their company culture. But there's rules around it. He doesn't have to take on that feedback. And then the person who gave the feedback must accept whether or not it gets taken on. But the principle of allowing open feedback, I think, is a brilliant one, something we try and do. And so, to my team, call me out on things when you should, and I hope they always feel like they can.
And I love that because, again, I won't name these examples because they'd be awkward and they'd be embarrassing. But over the years, I've had bids in situations where they've been ever so nervous, for example, about having an annual open meeting because they know they've got a really antagonistic business and they don't want to give them the mic. And I said, no, you've got to give them the mic. Let them have the mic. Let them stand up and say what they want to say. And even if it absolutely changes the tone of the meeting, we have to have that edge. You can't dampen it. Now, the irony is...
It might rally others to your cause.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Sorry. The irony is... the irony is, in one example, some time back, we absolutely had that happen. Somebody stood up and rallied from the sort of, cheap seats almost, and was very, very negative, and just wasn't justified in any of the negativity either. And other people in the audience, created this kind of ripple effect of other people in the audience were distancing themselves from that chat and were really frustrated by it. And actually then it created a really open, quite passionate dialogue about, no, but I don't agree with you. Don't you know what they do on this? You're wrong on this. They created that conversation. We should let that conversation happen. Now, sometimes sometimes that goes beyond reasonable. And if people can't behave professionally and appropriately and won't, then have their say and then accept comment or acceptance, you've got to draw the line. And I have been way back, one of the early bids, we did have one where he just wouldn't stop. And it was unfair on everybody else in the room because he just would not stop criticising. But open dialogue, open debate. Let's, bring it on. Let it happen.
It seems like since I've joined the industry that I've heard this call for standards a number of times. I think it's important for us to stress this is the minority.
Yeah.
Where we're seeing, everyone has these challenges, but actually where these challenges become a problem to the bid, that very much see these in the minority of places. But that these 11 principles, standards, seem like a really good starting point, or further than a starting point, a really good set of guidance for which bid managers should rely on.
And in terms of numbers, actually, so it's worth saying, of the about 340 bids that exist at the moment, nowhere near 340 have embarked and been awarded those standards. Nowhere near.
How does
and they should.
How does a bid get awarded these standards?
They apply to the bid foundation and they get assessed. They have to put their application in. It gets scrutinised, toing and froing, and they get awarded it by the bid foundation. And nowhere near enough of the industry have got it. There should be nothing on there that someone couldn't do. It should be a given that they achieve that. And it's not a lot of workload either.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in conclusion then, bids, what does good governance look like for a bid? Sum it up for us.
Well, it looks, coming back to that point about honesty and integrity, you need to be absolutely comfortable that you could be challenged by anyone on anything and you're doing the best job you can do. And you should be willing to provide that information to people. And if you're not, you've got to question why you're not. So every board director needs to know they're a legal director and they have responsibilities, and they need to take that responsibility properly, and they need to leave their own hat at the door when they come into a meeting and put the bid hat on. And they need to act in the best interests of that company. And they need to, when they see things, not unsee it. They need to act on it. Same from the staff side. If the staff are uncomfortable about what they're doing or what their board is doing, they need to be, brave enough to challenge those things, because it's other people's money and we need to spend it well and democratically.
Very good. Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome. Thank you.